Hi, my name is Hadi. I am technical lead at CitizenMe and I'm also Google Developers Expert for Android. Today I will talk about using Dagger in multi-module projects. What's a multi-module project? When a Gradle project has multiple modules, we call it a multi-module project. Why we use multiple modules in our projects? The first reason is to use instant apps and dynamic feature modules. With instant apps, users can enjoy our applications without installing them and have a chance to try it. Dynamic feature modules allows us to package some part of the application and download features whenever they are needed. Having multiple modules in projects would cause build speed improvements. Gradle can build modules in parallel if they don't depend on each other. We want to separate the logic. This is one of the core software engineering concepts, to separate logic whenever possible. We also call it separations of concerns. And finally, it's easier for teams to work in different modules rather than working in the same code base. Today we will review a sample application. This application only has login functionality and doesn't connect to a backend. This may not be an ideal setup for Dagger or Gradle modules, but I try to demonstrate as much as possible. Our sample project consists of 4 layers. The application module contains the core of the application. In the repository module, we have a repository that makes calls to the API layer. And finally, in our dynamic feature module, we have our login functionality. We call login to our dynamic feature module. In our login module, we have a login fragment. When user tries to log in, it will call the login view model. Login view model will pass that call to login repository, and login repository will make the API call to check if the user's information is correct. Now let's look at the Dagger setup. In the login module, we have a login component and a login Dagger module. And our login component depends on application component. With dynamic feature modules, we cannot use subcomponents because subcomponents require parent component to know about the child components. Instead, we use something called component dependencies. With component dependencies, dependee doesn't need to know about the dependent. And finally, we have a repository component. In an ideal world, we won't have a repository component, but I want to demonstrate a multi-module project, so I've added another module. If you look at the scopes, in our application, we use the application scope. As mentioned, in a real-world project, repository may not have its own components. Repository won't need a different scope if we included it in the application components. In the login module, we use feature scope. If we had register module as well, we would use feature scope on the register module as well, because the components with similar life cycles should share the same scope instead of having different scope on each other. Let's look at repository modules source code. As mentioned, we have repository scope. In the repository component, we have repository module as module. Repository module provides a login API and the base URL for the API. If we get back to repository components, you will notice that there is a variable called login API. We add an abstract variable or a function to expose our objects to the dependent components. In this case, we are exposing login API object to the other components. Let's look at application. We have application scope on the application module. Our component depends on the repository component. If you notice, in the factory we need to provide repository components since we depend on the repository components. Again, we want to expose our login repository to the dependent components. So we include it as an abstract variable. Now let's look at the login module and see how Dagger is configured. In the login component we use feature scope. If you notice, login component doesn't need any modules. It will be injecting the objects that are obtained from the dependency components. In this case, the application component. Again, it has a factory that would require a dependent components instance. In this case, application components. This component would inject the login fragments. So we add our inject method. In the application, we build our app component. But first, we construct our repository component and we fed it to application components factory to create the application component. We save it as an object to be able to use in other places of the application. In the login fragment, we have an injected view model factory. We will use this factory to provide view model objects. In our dynamic feature modules, we should depend on the application components. While we are creating the login component in the login fragments, we would need the application components. After we create the login components, we inject the login fragments, and then we will be able to use the view model. Just to recap, components which have similar life cycles should use the same scope instead of using different scopes on each of them. Secondly, we use component dependencies instead of subcomponents where we have dynamic feature modules. When we use dynamic feature modules, we need to expose objects to the dependent components explicitly. To do that, we need to add an abstract variable or a function to our component that contains that object. You can find the official documentation for using Dagger in multi-module projects. You can also review the sample I have created on GitHub. Thank you for listening. You can ask me any questions you have on Twitter. Hope to see you in a different video or an in-person event.